Hello, and welcome to the K class. Ooh, wow. The Kalamity class, or various other things therein of. They are one of these classes of submarines which comes up quite a lot, but honestly, what's as interesting as the K class is the concept which found them. And that's certainly what this video will focus on more of. Partially because after I'd reconstructed the original form of the video I'd had saved, I decided I didn't like it and thought instead of doing 3 videos of about 40 minutes, which each had a lot of repetition, I would just do one video and see if I could do it without repetition. We can hope. We can live in hope. So, here is the K class. K is for Calamity. And basically everything comes down to the idea that inspires them. Now, the first thing you have to remember is a fleet submarine's idea. Close support fast submarine. What they're aiming for was a submarine that could keep up with the fleet. Why does this matter? Why does it matter to have a submarine that can keep up with the fleet? Well, for starters, and this is something which is often forgotten, it's a Sunday punch. It's the idea that you can do something like, I don't know, the turn away, which is accomplished at Jutland. And the enemy will come running onto an unseen screen of submarines which will whittle down their numbers and take them away. It's the idea that any force has to sort of be treated warily because there could be something hidden in them. It's the idea, basically, that you are making your opponent have to base their actions off not only what they can see, but what potentially is there that they can't see. You are increasing the level of uncertainty in your opponent. Now, unsurprisingly, the Royal Navy has this sort of reputation of being this organisation which eschews things like submarines. They're ungentlemanly. They're not, the Royal Navy's way. Well, that's twaddle. That is really, really twaddle. In both the First World War and the Second World War and the periods in between, one of the largest, if not the largest, at points submarine service in the world is the Royal Navy's. Yes, I know. They don't get the cool and sexy discussions that go on in history circles that you will get about the Kriegsmarine submarines or the American submarines' attacks on the Japanese, or even to an extent the Japanese submarines. No, the Royal Marine, like the Royal Navy, like the Regia Marina, get ignored. And this is despite interwar trials and tests which lead to what the Royal Marines, some Royal Marines as they become the SBS, use submarines for in World War II. The Royal Navy has lots of ideas about how to use its submarine force in World War I and World War II. And please note, the submarines we're talking about, they're being built 1912, 1913, and again, 18 of the K class, the name class which are being searched, are built, 6 sink, but none are lost to enemy action. And that's not because they don't do war patrols. That's not because they're not active submarines in the Royal Navy's force structure. That's not because they're not being used. In fact, they are some very critical submarines. I have to admit, the E-Class probably gets up to a lot more. But even the E-Class, their more notable predecessor, is to an extent part of this genesis coming into this. All the large submarines, the Royal Navy is basically seeking this. Something which can do long-range patrols, but something which can also keep up with the fleet, forge ahead with the fleet. The trouble is this. Keeping up with a pre-dreadnought fleet is one thing. Keeping up with battleships is another thing. Keeping up with battlecruisers, oh my lord, is another thing entirely. And surface ships really pound on the speed a lot quicker than submarines do. And the range. Stardust they can. There is more space in a surface ship. A submarine has to be denser in its construction by its very nature. And there is also the fact that a surface ship carries one type of propulsion. Okay, it might be diesel electric, it might be gas diesel, there's all sorts of different combinations of that propulsion, but there's only one set. A submarine, by its very nature, until you get to nuclear-powered submarines, has to carry multiple. It will carry batteries, driving electric drive engine, and it might well, on the same shafts, have a different power supply, a diesel system connected. Or they might run a diesel electric system to both power those shafts and charge the batteries when they're on the surface. But honestly, that's not as common as you'd think in the earlier submarines, and the reason for that is because of reliability. Again, you're talking about the cutting edge. You're talking about needing Charlie Taylor-esque skills in designing these engines, this equipment for these submarines, because it is operating in a wholly new environment. You have to design these ships with seals, you have to design these ships with all sorts of things in them, and there is a reason submarines are called boats, because of course a boat can go on a ship can't go on a boat. But they're specialist. They really are specialist. And the first thing you have to also remember is that the Royal Navy doesn't just jump into this. The Royal Navy proceeds with vessels which are designed to testbed technologies for the Ks, the Nautilus and the Swordfish being two of the critical ones. You know, they are really trying to push. But they are also really pushing the technological edge. They want to push the capability edge, but to do that, they need to push the technological edge. And there is only so far you can go with the technology available at the time. I'm going to be recording a response video at some point to someone who's sent me a very long email, and in it they have called the Royal Navy system of beacon in the 1939 and flight navigation towards it baroque. Well, it seems to be better than the other systems available. That doesn't make it infallible by any stretch of imaginations in 1939. And it's about as best as they could design with the technology available. Yes, with hindsight, we can probably go back and go, well, if they'd invested in that tech then and invested in that tech and taken that to the development, they could have achieved that. But that's with hindsight. It's very much the same with submarines in the pre-World War I period, because the amount of growth that's going to happen during World War One in submarine numbers, in operational experience, is going to massively grow their capabilities. And this is something I cannot emphasize enough. One of the services which will do the most technological investment and the most growth will be the Royal Navy. Yeah, I know, shock, horror. The service which is, whenever you mention submarines in concert with, people go, oh, they are un-British. Yeah, there was an admiral who said that. Yes, he was a pillock. Yes. The rest of the admirals all agreed. They had a vote. Well, they didn't, but if they'd bothered to actually get around and have a vote, they would have called him, they would have voted he was a pillock. Instead, they just fought it. We know they did. Why? Because at the same time as he says that, the Royal Navy is setting up the Royal Navy Submarine Service and channeling a huge amount of money for the time into it. Yes, they're manned by volunteers. Yes. It really isn't fun being an early submariner, but so what? Large chunks of the Royal Navy are not really fun to be with. No one really wants to be in one of the torpedo boats when they first come in, let alone the torpedo boat destroyers, which get even more cramped and fun. Slowly these things improve, but it takes a lot of time. And let's be honest, the crew accommodations on board battleships was not that spectacular either. So, yeah, we have fleet submarines. And the idea behind the fleet submarines was that they would support the fleet. They would be the Sunday punch. They would be the thing which would scare the living bejesus out of the enemy. The K-Class weren't the first example of them, though. In fact, honestly, you can't really say it was even just these. But I'm going to mention the J-Class, and I've already mentioned the E-Class. Now, the J-Class, and I've got a picture of one of them here. I think it's... checking my notes. No. Yeah, J4. And I chose J4's picture because, frankly, it's taken of her in 1919 after she has been transferred to the Royal Australian Navy. And the reason she and the rest of the J-Class are transferred to the Royal Australian Navy was because the Royal Navy considered that the security of the Far East was going to be dependent upon cruisers and submarines to hold the perimeter until the battle fleet could get there. So they basically started telling the Royal Australian Navy, buy cruisers, buy subs. Cruisers will go offensive and interdict enemy trade and cause them a nightmare, so they have to spend their time hunting down them, and submarines will make it a nightmare for anyone to try and get close to you. Welcome to the subs, they're your defensive perimeter. For anyone who's noting any similarities between current Australian defence policy and this in 1919, I would just say go talk with Jamie from Armoured Carriers. He will probably start crying at one point, but The people in 1919 weren't stupid. The J class were effective, and the J class are not the only ones. You've also got the E class. Why is it whenever I do type that into my notes, Mercedes-Benz pops up? Ay, caramba. Now, there is also the D's and the L's. They all have a factor in this operation, in this creation of a fleet submarine, of a fleet force. Because even if they are not used specifically for the role the fleet submarine was supposed to be, i.e. keeping up with the fleet, long-range, larger submarines are part of the technological development process. I have to admit, and I've got a picture of them. Show me a picture. This is HMS Swordfish. Now, HMS Swordfish is the predecessor, the testbed for quite a lot of technologies which end up being involved in the K class, and a lot of the transit technologies which are used in the J class. But she never achieves all they wanted her to achieve. In fact, she's where they started to that there might be a ceiling to what they could achieve with diesel engines on the surface, because they designed her to try and achieve 20 knots, and she got to 18. Roger Keyes is particularly critical in pushing for her, in supporting her, and he is particularly inspired by actually Italian developments. This isn't a closed shop again. This isn't a closed idea. This is an idea which the Germans are pursuing. This is an idea the Italians are pursuing. A lot of navies are pursuing this because this Sunday Punch idea is amazing. It could turn a defeat into a victory. It could turn a successful maneuver into a devastating maneuver. It was basically considered the holy grail of submarine operations for this period. The idea of being able to have a submarine with your fleet. Unfortunately, though, she could max out at 18 knots. The J class, well, they do slightly better. They were built specifically because of apparent reports that there was a German submarine with supposedly a greater speed than 18 knots. That was the extent of the report, though, as far as I can see. So the J class get manufactured, and they have 3 shafts prime power, but it's 3 12-cylinder diesel engines underwater, battery-driven electric motors for a top speed of 19 knots. Yes, they got an extra knot thanks to having 1 extra shaft over the Swordfish. Swordfish had 2 shafts, J-Class had 3, and it got her an extra knot. Well, them an extra knot. Test depth they achieved was pretty darn good, and the J-Class have a fairly good operational history. They, well, don't get any massive successes. One managed to hit the SMS Grosse Kurhurst and the SMS Kronel Prince, damaging those two particular ships, but doesn't actually achieve much more than that. They literally damage two coining class, though. So let's be honest, that's kind of better than some of some results. So you have to be happy. And J2 managed to apparently sink at SMU-99 on the surface. And J6 was sunk by one of Britain's own Q ships. Yeah. But 6 survive World War I of the 7 built. That's a fairly decent class, and they've done well. They are as successful as they could be. Trouble is, they're not enough. They have all these lovely stats. They have 44 people. They have 6 18-inch torpedo tubes, and they have a 4-inch gun. They're lovely, but they can do 19 knots. They can do 19 knots. HMS Dreadnought can do 21 knots. Why is the battle fleet going to slow down? Battle cruisers can do even more. Why are they going to slow down? And that's on the surface. She can do 19 knots. Underwater, it's 9.5 knots. And let's be honest, the cruising speed of 12 knots and 4,000 nautical miles is not good. Really not. For what you want. And the trouble is, what you are doing is chasing a unicorn. The RN knew it was chasing a unicorn, but it was the unicorn which you needed, because if you got that unicorn, it was the unicorn. And I am using unicorn rather a lot. So this is what they come up with. They go back to the drawing board and they test things and they go, what can we do? What can we do? And it's the K class. And they are designed. They have a displacement of 1,980 tons on the surface, 2,500 tons dived. If we consider that compared to the previous vessels, well, the J class, they have put on a bit of weight. In fact, one could argue they put on 750 tons worth of weight. Howza! That's a whole nother submarine if you consider some of the smaller subs. Power now is down to 2 shafts again, but each is driving a 3-bladed 7-foot 6-inch screw propeller, and on the surface those are powered by 2 10,500 shaft horsepower oil-fired Yarrow boilers, pretty much straight out of destroyers, powering a Brown Curtis or Parsons geared steam turbine. Underwater, they have twin 1,440 horsepower electric motors. However, some Bright Spark only gives them one 800 horsepower Vickers diesel generator for charging the batteries on the surface. Not sure which Bright Spark that was, but probably it was because of limited space. Remember what I said about submarine density. This gave them a top speed of 24 knots surfaced and 8 knots submerged. So, if we think about it, they can now keep up with Dreadnought. They can keep up with the Northrun class. After all, their top speed is also 21 knots. They can keep up with the St. Vincent class. Again, 21 knots. They can keep up with HMS Neptune. 21 knots. Colossus class, 21 knots. They're doing well. Everyone's looking happy. Orion class, 21 knots. They're keeping up the battle fleet. King George V class, the original ones, 21 knots again. Everyone's still happy. Iron Duke class, 21 and a quarter knots. They're still keeping ahead of them. This is good. They can maneuver. And then the Queen Elizabeth class, 24 knots. Level pegging, but that's respectable. We'll give them that. So, the Royal Navy now has its dream. Or does it? What's that old saying? When God wishes to truly drive us insane, they grant us our wishes. Well, in this case, there's a problem. Yes, they can do 24 knots. Alright, not submerged. But they can only do 800 nautical miles at those 24 knots. Or they can do 12,500 nautical miles at 10 knots. This is sounding problematic. And while submerged 8 nautical miles at 8 knots. Ooh. That's not that great. Complement 59, 6 officers and rating, so it's gone up quite a bit. And armament. Well, they have 4 18-inch torpedo tubes beam, 4 18-inch bow torpedo tubes, and 8 spare torpedoes. 2 4-inch guns, 1 3-inch gun, and 2 18-inch deck tubes, which get removed later, probably sensibly, because there's enough problems. Okay. So, the Royal Navy's got what it wishes for. The trouble is, it's got the speed to keep up with the fleet, it hasn't got the legs. And then you've got the problems. This ship, this submarine, is complicated. This boat is a nightmare to try and con. And by that I mean navigate. It has a very small bridge area and a very small command area with very low profile relative to its size and its speed. There is a reason. If we go back to the beginning, the quote given is, "The speed of a destroyer, woohoo, the turning circle of a battlecruiser." Or, well, you can deal with that. And the bridge control facilities of a picket boat. Ooh. Now, I would say that particular WAG, which Norman Freeman quotes in his book, and this is the Genesis book I'm using for this particular discussion, is a little bit on the harsh side. But not that harsh. Honestly, I would argue that's more harsh on trawlers, which most picket boats were at this point. There were a few picket boats which weren't trawlers, they were smaller, but most were trawlers, and frankly, trawlers had quite good around sound vision in comparison. And let's consider that lovely, lovely shape. Starters. This is a submarine which is designed to spend a lot of its time on the surface. You can tell that from its bow shape and its overall hull dimensions. But it's also when you consider that it takes quite a while to dive. It is large and, well, despite that lovely deck house, which does make things look so much more proper than the canvas screens they normally use on submarines, they don't have the great view. They can't see people coming that way, and it takes them a while to dive. In fact, going from the steam power surface operation to underwater normally required roughly half an hour. Isn't that lovely? Crash dive is not really something you want to say if you're in a K class. And that's before you consider that they actually dive at such shallow depth that normally the commanding officer would have time for a walk around on the deck, check everything was bolted down tight, which they needed to because there were a lot of holes. Because again, it's designed with a destroyer power plant, and destroyers are designed for being on the surface and having a lot more air coming through them. The whole process of diving requires, well, first the boiler fires have to be extinguished. Then you have to make sure all the hydraulics and the mechanical rods and various levers that control those ever so cute funnels work, and then lower the funnels. And they have to be lowered away from each other, and then the hatches have to be closed over them to provide for water tightness. Then all the ventilators have to be closed. It's just not great. And that bow on the front, that particularly bulbous swan bow, was actually incorporated a quick blowing ballast tank. The idea is it would improve handling. My notes are there, by the way. Yeah, it's just no. I love the K class for their idea. I will say this now: the idea behind the Clay class, the J class, is the genesis for a lot of modern submarine thinking, and they are in many ways, in concept, ahead of their time. But in technology, there's a reason the concept is ahead of their time. In a particularly rough sea, water could get in through those funnels. And there wasn't much you could do about it, because it took 30 minutes to get under the water. During which time you have to have a lot of people exposed wandering around. The whole idea was, instead of a crash dive, they could run away at 24 knots. Oh, sorry. I'm a destroyer. I can do more than 24 knots. Hello. But they have their supporters. There are two of these. I will not hold it against them. There are two. There is one I will hold it against them. BT I will not hold it against, because BT doesn't think further than his own peak cap. Keyes is obsessed with submarines. So, what can I say? And Keyes is the gentleman on the left, and Beatty is the gentleman on the right. But the one in the middle, Admiral Sir John Jellicoe. There are so many problems here. Because at this particular point, he's a Commodore. Soon going to be promoted, but he's Inspector Captain of submarines. He loves submarines. These are his big submarines and his chance to get into fleet operations. He's going to push it. As said, I'm leaving him. He's Beatty. This man. Okay, maybe he saw the idea and was obsessed with the Sunday Punch. But when even Jackie Fisher, that well-known, sensible gentleman when it comes to ship design, I mean, have you seen Courageous, Furious, Glorious? So many other ideas. Incomparable, for starters. When Jackie Fisher says, the most fatal area imaginable would be put steam engines on submarines, which is not only quoted on Wikipedia, it's quoted in that book, it's quoted in another book on submarines I have up there. It appears on every single document I can find. And honestly, looking at this from perspective, yes, build one, build two. You have got a habit of building ships to test out ideas. Build a couple. Find it out. You do not need to build an entire class. They ordered 21 of them. They completed only 17, and one does get two numbers. It starts off life as K13 and then becomes K22. But that's after it sinks. I'm sorry, I'm going high-pitched. But Jellicoe, this is going back in time. There are very few of your decisions which I will which I cannot see a good logical reason behind. Ordering an entire class of Ds in 1913, you don't even have the excuse of it being during wartime. It is not wartime. These are designed in 1913. They might be ordered slightly later, but they are designed in 1913. You know that you have all the testing data. Why? Him, I understand. As said, he's obsessed with submarines, loves them, loves the idea of submarines, everything. Him, I just don't expect anything better from, honestly. Him? No. As I said, there is the reason that this is the dream, the unicorn, and theoretically this has the capability to do it. But even the designers admitted that it wasn't going to be quick, safe, or easy to do this. Which gets me to another point. I don't consider they deserve the title the Calamity class. I really don't. Because yes, they do have accidents. And yes, apparently at some points their crews do call themselves the Suicide Squad. Although I think myself that's probably modern translation of old stories. But, maybe. Sailors do love a good alliteration. You have the various accidents, and you have the Battle of May Island, which doesn't involve any enemy, just 9K class. K13 has the first rather major accident when, during sea trials, An intake failed to close whilst diving and her engine room flooded. One of the intakes for, of course, the steam engines. There's a lot of them. I never said the captains or the commanding officers enjoy walking round their ships as they're diving and having 5 or so minutes to wander around and check all the vents. It was just sensible commanding officers did so. In fact, sensible commanding officers took another pair of eyes and another pair of strong arms with them and a runner, just in case they had to order the dive to be aborted. K1 collided with K4 off the Danish coast the 18th of November 1917 and was scuttled to avoid capture, so that's how K1 disappeared. K13 became K22, because that would make it luckier. There's the Battle of May Island, which I'll talk about more in a second. K5 was lost due to unknown reasons during exercises in the Bay of Biscay on the 20th of January 1921. K15 sank at her mooring in Portsmouth on 20th of June 1921. K16 and K12 were both trapped on the bottom of the Gerlach, but they managed to do better than K13 and got off the bottom and got to safety. K3 held an unofficial record and an undesired record for maximum diving depth. Yeah, because the sub was so heavy it went too low. K4 ran aground on Walney Island in January 1917. Here is the thing I am eternally surprised. Most are scrapped by the end of 1926. K26 survives until 1931, when, thank goodness for the Royal Navy and for everyone else, the London Naval Treaty does one decent thing, the 1930 treaty, and gets rid of her. K18, 19 and 20 became the new M-class submarines. As if there weren't enough troubles with the M-class to begin with. As if those poor submarines didn't have enough problems. I know, they didn't actually convert them, it was their orders were cancelled and their place in the stocks were built, but associating the M-class with that juju was not good. The juju of steam-powered submarines. There's the Battle of May Island. The Battle of May Island is interesting. As 9K class proceeded to sea, they encountered minesweepers which had not been informed of their sortie. This is not, of course, down to bad design. What happens next is the issues. K14 managed to jam her helm trying to evade them, and K22, which had been formerly named K13, another submarine which, after it sunk, the Royal Navy managed to reuse. Surely sinking once is enough. Rammed her. Poor K14, if that wasn't enough, was then rammed by the battlecruiser Inflexible. What is amazing with all this, and I would like to say, is possibly the most amazing thing in this entire discussion, is that K14 isn't sunk. K14 stays afloat. It's amazing. I'm in shock by that one. That shows at least some qualities of them. So, Govern, thank you for that one. However, in this confusion created by all this ramming of K-14, by everyone, I'm not sure why they didn't like K-14 that day, Fearless managed to ram K-17. And then K-6 rammed K-4. And then K-4 was rammed again by K-7 because, you know, that wasn't enough. And K-17 and K-4 did sink. And 103 men were lost. 103 men. And I know I'm doing a bit jokey, but that's not good. And the reason they're lost, honestly, isn't because of the class. So this is why I don't think it's fair to call them calamities. And I know I spelled calamity with a K. Before anyone points that one out on here, I did it on purpose. Trust me, Microsoft Office has been telling me off about it non-stop. They are lost in May Island. 31st of January, 1918. The Battle of Jutland had happened long before this. There had been numerous experiences of operating at night since then, and the Royal Navy had been revising itself, but it hasn't revised itself quick enough. You have these ships, these submarines, these boats, wandering around in the dark without lights on because they're on tactical operating standards. And no one had told the minesweepers the submarines were coming. They're operating in close quarters with battle cruisers. They are a fleet. And no one had told the minesweepers they were coming. Before anyone asks, this is of course when, by which point, this gentleman is in charge of the ground fleet. So that might be why the lessons from Jutland hadn't been learnt. But honestly, even he should have been pushing for some proper night standards. Ay, caramba. The Dream, though, didn't die. Okay, it doesn't work. It doesn't work, and that is sad. It is sad. But that doesn't mean the RN are going to let it drop. In fact, they just change their idea. They go, right then, how can we get this to work? And this is one of the most popular names I ever get to say, River Class. Yes, this is HMS Thames, a River Class submarine. They are 2,206 tons on the surface and 2,723 tons submerged. They had a top speed of 22 knots on the surface and 10 knots submerged, and a complement of 61. Their propulsion was 2-shaft diesel electric, and they had 2 supercharged. Yes, you heard that right. Superchargers had come in. That helps. diesels, which were basically 10,000 shaft horsepower. Now, at this point, the RN had worked out that it didn't matter if the submarines had the speed to keep up the fleet at full battle rattle. In fact, they probably weren't going to. What mattered was that the RN could and would have a fleet a fleet of submarines which would keep up with the fleet. I'm using fleet a lot. When it was sailing out to post, when it was cruising around, when it was on normal operations heading in a direction, i.e. submarines it could deploy with the fleet. So this is where the River class really starts to matter. Why? Because the River class have a fairly decent range. They can actually get somewhere, which is nice. In World War II, Thames is lost off Norway in 1940. Clyde delivers supplies to Malta, and Seven and her then go on to serve in the Far East. Those three little ships are pretty darn critical, these three little boats. Because they keep the idea there. They keep the idea of capability out there, and it carries on. You know, the RN keeps working, keeps trying to come up with ideas for how to make a fleet submarine. There is no surprise at all about some of the attempts they make to want to make submarines faster. But the ultimate problem is you cannot overcome certain mechanical, technological issues. And the big one is diesel electric power. The power density, the amount of power you can get out, and the amount of power you can use to keep the submarine going. Well, here's the joyous thing. The idea really doesn't die. The Americans have the Gator class in World War II. Lots of nations have different submarines which can do it. And the idea of a fleet submarine, or a submarine that can operate in concert with the fleet, can advance with them at speed, can be wherever they are in the world, and, well, nowadays, to conduct anti-submarine warfare operations, but still be a critical asset for anti-surface operations. That's very much the role of the modern nuclear submarine. If we think about it, yes, they will do the traditional submarine jobs of basically blockade, but trade interdiction and intelligence gathering, anti-submarine operations, probably. Lots of different things, but think about the current conversation which is going on about the task group the British are sending, or is being formed around by Britain and America, Denmark, around HMS Queen Elizabeth on her deployment to the Far East later this year in 2021. It's presumed, it's a constant assumption that one of the vessels not being mentioned as part of the task group is a submarine. The odds are there is going to be an Astute class operating with them. Probably not in the Mediterranean and probably not in the Atlantic. But the moment they hit the Indian Ocean and start heading for the Far East, they will more than likely have a submarine around them. It might even be an American submarine. Odds are it will be a British one. Might even be both. They might have two subs there. We won't know unless someone decides to make a very big political point by having them surface somewhere to point it out. But the odds are they're there. And even if they're not, no one can really presume they're not. Because, let's be honest, range, unlimited. Top speed, submerged, probably somewhere in the region of 30 knots. We don't know. Probably. Deployment usually based around 90 days in terms of the food, etc. carried and endurance of the crew. And we all can testify that a task group which has one of these in it is far more powerful than a task group which doesn't. Or has one operating nearby it. So, K-Class. Strategically, operationally, conceptually, pretty decent idea. How can we say that? Because navies near over 100 years later are very much still delivering that idea because it works. It's a good idea. Because if you want to make anti-submarine warfare operations very difficult, and yes, I have been watching too many episodes of Scrubs probably recently, you slap a surface task group over it. And if you want to make anti-surface operations very difficult to conduct for enemy submarine or enemy surface forces, you put a submarine underneath it. Add in a carrier, which can provide a large degree of organic airborne early warning and organic air control, and you've made life very, very complicated for any opponent. Because that's the real dirty secret of modern naval operations. That's the real thing they were searching for in the First World War, which is why the K-Class communism is you want to build this multi-spectrum force. You want a whole force capability. You see, having a system which allows you to attack in one dimension is great, but the enemy can tend to block one dimension. So you want to be able to attack from all sorts of different angles at the same time. The K-Class, the idea was that you'd be fighting a fleet battle. Well, hey, you'd have your ships ranged up, blasting away with each other. Yes, we know what this is, but hang on. They've got just enough speed that they can maneuver to a position ahead of the enemy fleet. From your fleet, submerge, line up, and where no one knew they were. Because, let's be honest, the idea was that everyone else presumed they'd be moving around too fast that submarines couldn't have kept up. This is why the Germans wanted, this is why the British wanted, why the Italians wanted, why the French wanted, why everyone wanted it. Well, now we have it. Now we have a submarine which can dive back in under the cover and dive out of a surface task group. And that surface task group is key to keeping that submarine alive. Because the big threat to that submarine is not enemy submarines, it's the whole spectrum of enemy force. Because, let's be honest, Astute is probably one of the best submarine designs in the world. There is the Seawolves, there is the Virginias, there are the Astutes. The Russians and the Chinese probably have some excellent designs on paper, but they don't yet have them in service. and we're not out of sensitivity to our Australian listeners and counterparts, we will not mention the French. But they're quite good nuclear ones. Diesel. The point is, the K-class lead up to these. Technologically, it's a terrible idea. Steam-powered submarines in that point are terrible. I know someone's going to come back to me and go, but nuclear submarines are steam submarines because the reactor turns a steam turbine by superheating a liquid. Yes, I know. Okay? Yeah, fine. But it's not a steam engine. It's not an oil-burning steam engine that requires funnels and has all the accoutrements that go into the K-class. All right? The threat to a modern submarine is not one-dimensional, it's multidimensional. The response from a fleet which wants to get the best out of its submarines has to be multidimensional as well. It doesn't matter how good an individual component is. Not if the other components around it aren't there or don't match up. This is why you require enough, and enough is probably more than the British are probably going to get of the Astutes. Because let's be honest, when the Astutes were being ordered, it was also considered a sensible idea to just have two large aviation ships. They're both incredibly capable assets, and I wouldn't want to build any smaller myself. But we can all agree that if you only have two and one has an accident, whether intentional or unintentional, you then have a problem, especially if the other one's in refit. And it's not in a way which can be quickly got out of refit. So, that's it. The K-class. It's a concept ahead of its time. Technology, well, it was the only way they could get a submarine up to 24 knots. It's the only way they could get a submarine up to 24 knots. But by goodness gracious me, they should have stopped with an experimental. If they'd done 2 or 3 experimentals, they would be looked at as innovative and attempt to push the envelope. And the British could have probably gone, right then, you know what, jumped onto something of the river class size earlier. And have gone, well, actually, what can we get? Can we supercharge an engine? Can we supercharge a diesel engine? Can we put bigger diesel engines in? What can we do? And will 22 knots be enough? 24 knots is the dream. 22 knots might be enough. So, what have I got coming up? Well, today it's the K-class submarines. On the 27th of April, it's dreadnoughts from around the world. I'm rebuilding that PowerPoint. 4th of May, it's Monitors of the Royal Navy, Section 3. That was supposed to come out last week, but sorry. 11th of May, Extended Patron 21, Ian Carr's Notable World War II Commanders. There's going to be a couple more added in. And 18th of May, Battle Cruisers Take 2. You voted for it on Twitter. It's coming. What have we got on Thursday? We have got the 22nd of April, Patron 22. Timothy Sims, if the Cold War went hot in 1986, would NATO's navies be capable of stopping Soviet subs ravaging the merchant fleet? I know, I couldn't have timed it better myself. The Patron 22 is on the 22nd of April. It's meant to be. So, thank you everyone. I hope you've enjoyed. If you do like the videos, please do like, share, subscribe. There's all the little buttons down there. Thank you. And if you fancy carrying on the conversation, comment below or join Discord and have a chat there. And if you feel like funding my very expensive book habit, because I buy lots of them, because, well, I'm a historian. Buying books is what we do instead of having a personality. Then, thank you. Have a nice day and take care. Bye. I still love Solvetrish. She does look cute. I'll expand her a bit for you all to look at her a bit more. Yeah? Doesn't she look cute? And you can see where the K-Class ideas do come from. But again, couldn't they have just stuck with that? Or built a couple more like it? Ay, caramba. Take care.